of the marriages. At that point, the atmosphere heated up. Donatella, a woman in her 50s, shook her head. Candle, a young woman on my right, exclaimed that the problem was the translator at the embassy. Versace, another refugee, reported that the previous week 28 Eritreans applied for reunification, but only 2 had been accepted, and he added, "But the marriages were true, I know it." Then Agos continued with the last point of his speech. Fourth point, because of colonization, I think that Italy has the obligation to receive and welcome Eritreans. Thank you for listening. At that point, I explained that I could not change laws on asylum and regulation on international migration, and I tried to clarify their doubts about visa proceeding and rights of asylum seekers. But my answer did not bring any solution to their problem, and most of them left the room unsatisfied. Jonas, the 22-year-old translator for the occasion, smiled bitterly while walking out of the door and murmured, "I do not need any visa process. My legs will be my process." And in fact, he intended to cross the desert and the Mediterranean in the next few months with the help of smugglers. Jonas' statements powerfully exemplifies the determination of many Eritrean refugees to vindicate what they perceive as their rights through actions. The practice of unauthorized border crossing to Europe was not negatively sanctioned by the group of Eritreans I met. Rather, it was considered to be the only possible choice to an unfair social and geographic immobility in Africa. Likewise, the Syrian visa regulation for the purpose of obtaining visas were not perceived as immoral acts because embassies and what they represent were not recognized as legitimate authorities and their rules were not understood as fair. As some scholars such as Rio and Sheridan have pointed out in their analysis of the US-Mexico border crossing practices, national borders are often contested entities and do not necessarily hold a moral value for those who cross them. Likewise, refugees' deceits in institutional settings, legal non-compliance to institutional borders is not the result of a moral decay of an exiled population. Rather, these strategies of irregular migration emerge from the lack of submission to international moral order, which does not reflect refugees' ethical views. Agos' hierarchy of blame for recent migrant fatalities illustrate the extent to which refugees' perspective challenge widespread conception of history, rights, and responsibility implicit in the public discourse of unauthorized migration. Faced with the death of their compatriots at sea, Agos and the other refugees apportioned blame first to the Eritrean government, who was pushing them to leave the country, and then to the international community, since they did not enable refugees to move freely to Europe and other developed countries. Although perception about smugglers were not univocal among refugees I met, smugglers were not even mentioned among the possible responsible for the migrants' deaths. In fact, my informants in Ethiopia and Sudan, while speaking about the facilitators of unauthorized migration, rarely expressed a moral judgment towards their activities. Their judgment mostly focused on the reliability of their services. The problem for them was, is he a professional or not? Can he take me to the other side safe? This perspective completely overturns common interpretation of unauthorized migration in international public discourse, which usually identifies the smugglers as the main responsible for migrants' death, and rarely consider the connection between these deaths and the paradoxes of the asylum and migration regime. Agos' arguments were in that period materialized in organized protests against the symbol of international asylum regime and Western nations. Just a month before I arrived in Ethiopia, October 2013, a large protest had taken place in the camps in the north of the country. In occasion of a mourning ceremony for the victims of Lampedusa shipwreck, refugees voiced their anger towards a system that in their eyes did not provide them with any long-term prospect. For that, they had risked their life at sea. Peaceful demonstrations were held, but smaller groups of young refugees also threw stones at local bureaux. Significantly, the most violent acts especially targeted UNHCR offices and services, symbols in the refugees' eyes of the current asylum regime. In fact, the main claim sustaining the protest was that Lampedusa tragedy had been the consequence of insufficient resettlement quotas from the camps. It is interesting to notice how Agos instrumentally endorsed the Italian discourse, which pictured Eritrea as an Italian territory, and turned it against the current restrictive visa policies. His argument claimed to to some extent, the unrighteousness of any restrictive measure to free circulation between Italy and Eritrea. Hago's words were pointing to historical colonial connection, which Italy has arguably tried to forget. One of the last most relevant examples of this attempt to hide colonial history is represented by the closure of Isiao, the most important archive of documents about Italian history in the Horn of Africa. Hago's call for Italian responsibility towards its earlier colonial subject was not new to me. I had heard similar post-colonial claims during my experience with asylum seekers in the reception center in Follonica, Italy, a place in Tuscany. There, Eritreans waiting for their interview with the Asylum Commission often complained about the injustice of their condition. One of their most common arguments was, Italians have been in Eritrea for over 50 years. Why should we ask permission to come here now? Although these claims are specific to Eritreans and their relationship with Italy, I think they also point to a larger issue, which is relevant for Italy and Europe, as well as for the US. Migrants' mobility path highlight historic and geopolitical connections. If Eritreans remind Italians of their colonial past, Salvadorans and Guatemalans remind Americans of a history of US-backed military regimes and wars, which have affected the countries until today. The ongoing refusal to allow these people to access asylum is telling of a similar attempt to forget part of history. Let me now sum up and see what we can learn about all this. Listening to migrants' voices and to their account of history is crucial to unsettle current discourse on migration crisis. In fact, this ethnographic vignette is useful to criticize the category of crisis in several aspects. First, while the crisis paradigm constructs refugees as results of external crisis to the EU, my informants claim an intimate connection between migration and a history of political and cultural connection that are often forgotten. Second, the paradigm of crisis and its call for urgent action need culprits. Those often come to be identified in the middlemen who provide the services for geographic mobility, while these migrants illustrate a different perspective on who to blame, not the smuggler, but along with their political authorities, the Western states who did not provide them with alternatives to a life in a refugee camp. Third, while the paradigm of crisis makes refugees into desperate victims without agency, my ethnographic fieldwork, exemplified by this vignette, shows the awareness, the criticism, and the political agency of those who are crossing the borders. It also shows the blurred boundaries of categories, such as those of migrants and refugees. Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia try to enter in Europe by becoming reunifiable family members, according to the regulation of the migration system, and then become unauthorized migrants, asylum seekers to Europe, when they are not given the possibility to move there legally. This shows the limit of these categories, which are used as ultimate definition in public discourse, and illustrates the connection, overlapping, and intersection of being a migrant and being a refugee in the everyday life of those who are seeking mobility. Finally, it illustrates a point of view of those who do not experience a migration crisis, but an immobility problem. My informants feared existential immobility, the lack of prospects, and limited possibilities to access education, work, and freedom. These issues have remained hidden in the current international asylum and migration regime. Their critique to the system points to an ongoing systematic structural shortcoming, which condemn refugees to be protected, but immobile. While when everyone's attention focuses on mobility, we should rather ask why people who want to move cannot do so. Thank you.
Totally fascinating. I think these are important keywords. Like I, for one, never thought about immobility as part of the migratory process. It's a really interesting point. But I wonder if other people have questions that they'd like to ask Milena. Okay. So I assume you presented your work to people who also work on the Syrian refugee crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So what do they say to your attempt to take the word crisis, if not out of the equation, at least to make it more complicated? Do they agree with you?
Well, I haven't had the specific feedbacks from people who have been working on the Syrian problem. My work, as I specified, mainly, and the critique of this category crisis, mainly is based on all the other situations except Syria that have been going on for decades. But I think Syria is going to become a very similar case because what's happening in Syria is not going to solve in a few years or a few months. So I think that's relevant on the long term for Syria, but Syria is still somehow an exception because it's really something recent that has recently happened. And so people there, although people there can actually face something like a sudden movement, they have no choice, they have just to flee. But even within the Syrian context, there will be people who have a choice and still decide that they have no long-term prospect in Syria and they have to leave, or people who instead have no choice. So it's very diversified even in Syria. Like a country, Syria is a country, and there are areas where the conflict is mostly is exploding, and areas where crisis is already starting to be more protracted somehow. And we start to see the conditions of the implications of the wars that are not necessarily the right away consequences of the war, not necessarily the violence or.
That's a very good point. Thank you. This is so fascinating, and I think again to put it in a global perspective is just incredibly important, especially because, as you said, so much of the discussion around this issue is so politicized, especially in Europe, but actually also in America. I mean, a lot of people who voted for Trump say that they did so in part because they were worried that Syrians were going to flood into America the way they flooded into Europe. So I have two questions. One is very specific. So you talked about the blurred boundaries between migrants and refugees, and that's something I've encountered as well, trying to teach undergraduates about the migrant crisis or the refugee crisis. It seems like just the word you use immediately kind of puts you in a camp. Like, do you believe that economic migrants are refugees, or do you, sort of take the, do you, like, I can't remember which country, whether it was Germany, decided that Afghans were not refugees, they were just migrants, they were economic migrants. And do you just sort of use those political or governmental categories? I seem to take it that you just use refugee almost across the board, but I'm curious to know how you yourself end up dealing with those blurred categories and which words you use. And then second, you mentioned the Geneva Convention in 1951. My understanding of that is part of the problem is that the convention gives the right to exit, but not the right to enter. Right? So everybody is guaranteed universality, not that that's, as you said, actually, the immobility of even being able to leave a dangerous situation is a big problem, but nonetheless, there's this kind of fundamental imbalance, and I just wonder how that fits in, and it seems so intractable to me because it seems like nobody is going to fix that. But I'm curious.
Thank you for the very interesting questions. Well, I mostly use refugees when I speak about my case study because once Eritreans cross the borders with Ethiopia, they are recognized as de facto refugees. So I use it because they're actually refugees. They have that status. But yeah, I mean, I have a hard time dealing with these categories. On the one hand, because I recognize the importance of keeping that category for protection issues. But on the other hand, what that category does is excluding a lot of people on the basis that they do not fit into the definition. Although, recently, not so recently, but in the last decades, we've been talking about more labels for refugees. So we have environmental refugees, gender refugees. We see a multiplication of labels for refugees. So the need for protecting more people, but it goes hand in hand with weakening that somehow definition, and also seeing its limits. I think when I think about the international asylum regime and its shortcomings, and I also try to put it in comparison and analyze it with the migration, the national migration management. So the fact that you need to be an asylum seeker to cross the Mediterranean and then put your asylum application once you get to Europe, it's a big problem, I think. Like, why people can't have more avenues to actually apply for asylum or simply migrate. So I think, I do not have easy solutions, and I think it's a very intractable problem. But I think if any solution is going to come in this field, I think it's by rethinking together the two systems. So the international asylum regime and the migration management have to be rethought in a different way, I think. Did I answer both your questions? Okay.
Milena, thanks for the really wonderful presentation. I have just a very simple question. In your research, your official research, or your exposure to ideas just being in close proximity to the subject matter, have you found any points where there's an overlap or commonality between the point of view of the refugees and or migrants and host countries or places of desire to go? Have you seen any commonality in terms of perception?
Of where they want to go?
Of the problem of the crisis.
Of the problem of the crisis. Well, it's hard because, like, even somehow the perception and representation in my informants account and when I was talking to them was very much influenced by the fact that they were talking to me sometimes, and so they wanted to justify their need for going to a place instead of another. So it's somehow, well, I think both Eritreans and the European governments would agree that Eritrea, for example, is not a free country, and that for that reason people who escape from there need protection and have a legitimate case for asylum. So specifically for Eritreans, that would be the point of the common point. But when it comes to smugglers, then really perception completely diverge because for governments and they are the ones who put people at risk, who kill them, or but I mean, although this is a very complex universe of people, even of different roles, because I mean, there are people who drive, there are people who negotiate, who put in touch the demand with the offer, and so all these people are different. They have different roles and they have a different relationship with the migrants. So not all of them are considered the same way by the migrants, but they are not considered the cause of the problem. Like, the cause of the problem are seen elsewhere, in the fact that there is a need for geographic mobility and there is no way to satisfy that demand somehow. That was the main problem for my informants. And in fact, it's very interesting because I met many young graduates who have applied for study visa in Europe or in the US, and they had been rejected their visa, not because even if they had a scholarship, they had been accepted in universities in Europe and the US, they could not give them the guarantee that they would have returned upon the expiration of a visa. Naturally, I mean, they come from a refugee-producing country, none of them would have gone back. But that somehow limited even more their possibility to apply for legal avenues and really gave them just only one choice if they didn't want to stay where they were.
Thank you, Milena. I somehow the world and trying to deal with this refugee crisis has narrowed and limited their understanding of their duty to those people as universal human rights instead of these more specific and more modern rights. Just that they want to get somewhere, they want to study. They have specific reasons for going to that country because there are particular opportunities, but instead they're all being covered by this blanket-based universal human rights.
Yes, I mean, I think humanitarian as well as crisis are two words that are somehow used for emergencies, for something that should be short term, but it's not. So humanitarian mainly covers what is food and shelter and safety, but that's not what people want in the long run, right? For sure they want safety, but safety cannot be their prison somehow. So, and it's like the two, I think your question was, your comment was really good, because in fact in the literature that's what is always spoken about, the fact that the humanitarian paradigm somehow limits our understanding of protection to refugees and their rights to have a political life as well. Because, for example, in camps, many people are prevented from, because, I mean, you see, you receive a foreign population in a country that has already usually a lot of problems, a lot of political instability problem as well. And you don't want refugees to start doing political activities. So, for example, even the fact of being political agents is somehow not granted for refugees. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Milena. I have a question. I was really interested in what you were saying about the different kinds of moralities that are structured around the particular experience of trying to emigrate or migrate, depending on which direction you're going. And I'm curious if you've talked to anybody who successfully made it through that process, ended up in a different country, possibly with a permanent spot. And I'm curious how that morality or that sense of justice or fairness intersected with their new role in this new space.
Well, it's very interesting. Actually, I haven't been to the final destination of their journeys because I stopped in Italy, and for most of them, Italy was not a destination, but was more of a transit place. So at that point, they were still saying, okay, here we have to some extent safety and freedom, but we do not have we do not have what we were looking for, because in these cosmologies of destinations, like that is usually shared by refugees and their families back home, migration is not only an individual way of surviving, but also a way to provide for families and so to contribute to the family well-being. And as in Italy, most of them struggled with finding a job, finding an accommodation. They were not able to send remittances and support their families back home. So this meant that many of them didn't have contact with their families because they were ashamed of not being able to provide. And it was interesting because as I knew the refugees in Italy, and then I met their families in Eritrea, it was interesting to listen to their complaints and to the ideas of the families of what their sons should have done. So they were saying, why they just don't leave it, why don't they go forward? And then I knew that the sons had already tried harder, but because of the Dublin regulation, that is one of the European regulation that does not allow asylum seekers to seek asylum in more than one country, and they are practically obliged to seek asylum in the first country in which they reach. So they couldn't go forward, and they were stuck. And so this somehow was like creating a lot of contradictions between them and their families, and a lot of struggles. but I haven't been to the last destination, so it's going to be part of the next research, I hope. And at that point, I will be able to see, yeah, exactly what's their imagination of that destination, and how the reality and the imagination go together, interact.
Thank you. I mean, I think that it's really compelling work on two levels, both intellectually and emotionally. And my question is about how do you make those two work as, you know, as an intellectual who made a very clear and very intriguing argument towards immobility, but also the fact that you are living in these places, and you use the term informant, right? Like, it made me think about like how do you keep enough distance to be able to have the objectivity to define your work, as well as the bonds that you create with all being living in these places.
Yeah, it's well, it's not easy, but somehow when you keep working in these environments, you also develop a way to protect yourself from, and I think to be emotionally engaged and to be friends. I mean, I believe that being friends with the people that I met was important for me to understand something that someone who was just coming as a consultant or someone just staying there for 1 week and interviewing people wouldn't have grasped somehow. I think that by staying with people, by sharing their emotion, by sharing their anxieties, we can really understand better what they go through. But this doesn't mean that I could not see also the lies they were telling me. For example, I mean, I was friends with these people that wanted me to believe that their marriages were real marriages. But I knew very well they were not real marriages, because I had a way of triangulate my information. I had met many other Eritreans from other perspectives in other countries, and this allowed me to say, okay, well, marriages are not true, so I know it, but still, I mean, it's not that I couldn't sympathize with their case or with. So I don't know. It is a long discussion about what's the distance that an intellectual should, an anthropologist especially, should keep with his her informants. But well, it's an open ethical dilemma, because I mean, when you're in these environments, you also somehow people demand from you a lot. Like, there is also an imbalance of power relations. So the fact that I was white with a passport, with more money than they had, put me in a condition sometimes that I thought, well, how am I going to go to overcome this? Sometimes people were calling me from Libya saying, would you please help me to pay my journey? But too many people called me for that, and I could not. And also, I didn't believe it was right to do that. So, but it's an ethical dilemma. I don't know what someone else would have done, and there are no handbook that tells you you should behave like this or should behave like that. But thank you for the question.
Well, I think at this point we'll thank Milena for this part of the presentation and just continue the conversation upstairs, where everybody can, I think, ask you more candidly the kinds of things that this fascinating research has brought to light. So thank you very much.
Thank you.